Welcome to Sci-Fi Facts, where every movie hides a secret. Every scene tells a deeper story. And every frame contains details most viewers never notice, from legendary blockbusters and mind-bending science fiction to dark thrillers, unforgettable horror, and hidden cinematic gems. We explore the facts, theories, Easter eggs, behind-the-scenes secrets, and untold stories that make movies truly unforgettable. This isn't just watching movies, this is discovering what lies beneath them. Subscribe to Sci-Fi Facts and step beyond the screen. That decision immediately makes the story easier to connect with, because Jack Bruno isn't presented as the smartest person in the room or someone who already has all the answers. He's simply trying to get through an ordinary day before his life suddenly takes a completely unexpected turn. That's probably the first thing I liked about Andy Fickman's direction. He doesn't waste much time explaining every mystery before giving the audience a reason to care. The film opens with enough momentum to grab your attention, but it also knows when to slow down and let the characters react naturally. A lot of family adventure movies become so focused on reaching the next action sequence that they forget people need a reason to stay emotionally invested. Here, the mystery grows alongside the characters instead of replacing them. Dwayne Johnson also feels surprisingly comfortable in this type of role. Looking back at his filmography, it's easy to see why studios kept casting him in action projects. But Race to Witch Mountain reminds you that his biggest advantage has never been muscles or fight scenes. It's his ability to make ordinary conversations feel relaxed and believable, even when the movie starts introducing ideas clearly rooted in science fiction. He reacts like a normal person would. That grounded performance gives the audience someone familiar to follow while everything else grows stranger with each passing scene. The movie also deserves credit for understanding its target audience. It isn't trying to compete with darker science fiction films built on complicated mythology or endless plot twists. Instead, it focuses on delivering a fast-moving adventure that younger viewers can enjoy without leaving older viewers feeling ignored. That's a difficult balance, because family films often lean too heavily in one direction as some become so childish that adults lose interest, while others turn so serious they forget the sense of fun that made people buy a ticket in the first place. Race to Witch Mountain doesn't get every decision right, but for most of its runtime, it understands exactly what kind of experience it wants to deliver. One thing that stood out on rewatch was how practical many of the action scenes still feel. Yes, there are visual effects throughout, but the filmmakers don't lean on computer-generated imagery every few minutes just to create excitement. Car chases, physical stunts, and real locations still do a lot of the heavy lifting. And I honestly think that helps the movie hold up better today than if every sequence had been built almost entirely inside a computer. The effects may not look groundbreaking by today's standards, but they support the adventure rather than becoming the adventure themselves. Pacing is another area where the film makes a smart choice. At just under 100 minutes, it understands that this story doesn't need to stretch far beyond its natural length. The mystery keeps moving. New information arrives at a steady pace, and the film rarely lingers on ideas the audience has already grasped. That's not to say every scene works perfectly. There are moments where the dialogue feels a little too simple, but the overall rhythm keeps things entertaining enough that these smaller weaknesses never become major distractions. Something else worth mentioning is how much the movie benefits from its lighter tone. Around the late 2000s, a lot of fantasy and science fiction films were growing noticeably darker, but Race to Witch Mountain stays committed to being an adventure the whole family can watch together. It never loses the sense that discovery should be exciting, even as the stakes grow larger. That choice won't satisfy viewers craving complex science fiction, but I think it suits the movie's identity far better than trying to imitate more serious films from the same period. The background of the project is interesting too. This wasn't an entirely original idea. Disney was revisiting one of its older live-action properties and giving it a modern update rather than producing a scene-for-scene remake. That gave the filmmakers room to introduce faster pacing, modern technology, and bigger action sequences while keeping the central concept recognizable. It's a good example of how a studio can refresh an older story without simply copying everything that came before. From a business standpoint, the movie was made on a reported budget of around $65 million and went on to earn a little over $100 million worldwide. Those numbers didn't make it one of Disney's biggest theatrical hits, but they didn't turn it into a failure either. Audience reactions were generally warmer than critical ones, with many viewers saying they appreciated the fast pace, Dwayne Johnson's performance, and the fact that the movie never became too complicated for younger audiences. Reading those reactions after revisiting the film actually tracks, because that's exactly the impression I came away with. It isn't aiming to redefine the science fiction genre, it's aiming to provide an enjoyable adventure for families, and judged on those terms, it does a better job than it's often given credit for. The more time I spent with the movie, the more I appreciated its decision to keep the mystery simple instead of building an unnecessarily complicated science fiction universe. A lot of adventure films introduce so many rules, organizations, and fictional technologies that the audience ends up spending more time trying to understand the world than enjoying the story. Race to Which Mountain takes the opposite approach. New information arrives gradually, and even when the film starts revealing bigger ideas, it explains just enough to keep everything moving. That fits the pace of the movie because it lets the adventure remain the main attraction instead of getting bogged down in long stretches of exposition. Jack Bruno also becomes a more interesting lead the longer the film goes on. What I enjoyed most about Dwayne Johnson's performance is that he never acts like someone who already knows exactly what to do. He's constantly reacting to situations that would confuse almost anyone, and those reactions help keep the audience grounded. If the lead character accepted every unbelievable event without hesitation, the story would lose some of its credibility. Instead, Jack responds with the same mix of curiosity, disbelief, and determination that most people probably would, which makes him easy to follow. Another reason the movie stays entertaining is that it never forgets it's supposed to be fun. Even as the danger increases, there's still enough humor and lighter moments to keep the experience from becoming overly serious. I think Andy Fickman understood that younger viewers don't necessarily need a darker tone to feel invested. They simply need characters worth spending time with and enough momentum to keep the story moving. The film isn't trying to compete with large-scale science fiction epics, and honestly, it benefits from knowing its own limits instead of chasing something it was never designed to be. Watching it again also reminded me how much practical filmmaking still carries many of the action scenes. There are visual effects throughout, but they usually support what's already happening rather than replace it. Cars still crash into real environments, actors still perform physical sequences, and the locations give the adventure a sense of scale that pure CGI backdrops often struggle to achieve. Some of the effects naturally showed their age compared to modern productions, but they never distracted me, because they were always serving the story rather than trying to become the whole attraction. One area where opinions tend to be divided is the screenplay. Some viewers want a deeper character development and a more complex plot, while others appreciated how straightforward everything stayed. Personally, I think the script succeeds whenever it leans into momentum and character chemistry. It occasionally favors speed over emotional depth, but given the audience Disney was aiming for, that feels understandable. Not every family adventure needs to be a heavy character study. Sometimes a movie simply wants to entertain for 90 minutes. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as it delivers on the promise. The supporting cast also helps keep the energy consistent without pulling focus from the central adventure. Rather than trying to overshadow Dwayne Johnson, the people around him each contribute a piece of the story, helping the mystery unfold at a comfortable pace. That balance keeps the film from feeling crowded, which matters because adventure movies can easily become confusing once too many characters start competing for screen time. I also liked how rarely the camera makes the action hard to follow. A common problem in modern adventure films is that fast editing creates excitement at the expense of clarity. Here, Most chase sequences and action beats stay easy to understand because the audience always has a good sense of where the characters are and what they're trying to accomplish. It might not be the flashiest style of filmmaking, but it's an effective one, especially for a family audience. Aaron Zigmund's score quietly deserves more appreciation than it usually gets. The music doesn't constantly announce itself, yet it gives the adventure a sense of movement that ties everything together. During quieter scenes it adds a feeling of mystery, while the bigger action moments gain just enough energy without becoming overwhelming. It's the kind of soundtrack that supports the experience instead of competing with it, and I think that was exactly the right choice for this film. One interesting production detail is that Disney didn't simply recreate the older Escape to Witch Mountain beat for beat. The studio wanted this version to stand on its own, updating the concept for a new generation that expected faster pacing, bigger action, and more advanced visual effects. That decision naturally shifted the tone as the original leaned more toward mystery, while this version clearly embraces the action-adventure side of the concept. Whether someone prefers one approach over the other usually comes down to personal taste, but I understand why Disney chose to modernize it instead of copying the earlier film. Audience reactions over the years have been surprisingly consistent. Even people who admit the movie isn't perfect often describe it as an enjoyable family adventure that's easy to revisit. I think that's a fair description, because the film never pretends to be more ambitious than it actually is. It delivers a fast-moving science fiction adventure, gives Dwayne Johnson a role that suits his personality, and keeps the experience accessible for viewers of different ages. Sometimes that kind of honesty works better than a movie trying to be bigger, darker, or more complicated than its story needs. One thing that became clearer the longer I watched was how much of the film's success depends on casting. You can have an interesting science fiction premise and plenty of action, but if the audience doesn't enjoy spending time with the main character, the whole adventure starts feeling mechanical. Dwayne Johnson avoids that problem because he brings a relaxed personality to Jack Bruno. He isn't constantly trying to look tough, and the movie doesn't ask him to deliver dramatic speeches every few minutes. Most of the time he's simply reacting to strange situations while trying to protect the people around him, which makes him feel approachable, exactly what this kind of family adventure needed. Another detail I appreciated is how the movie keeps moving without making every scene feel rushed. There's a difference between fast pacing and impatient storytelling. Fast pacing keeps the audience interested, while impatient storytelling jumps from one big moment to the next without giving viewers a chance to connect with what's happening. Race to Witch Mountain usually stays on the right side of that line. It knows the audience came for mystery and adventure, but it still allows quieter moments to exist so the action doesn't become exhausting. The science fiction side of the film is also surprisingly accessible. Some movies bury viewers under complicated explanations and endless invented terminology, but this one keeps things straightforward. That doesn't necessarily make it a deeper film, but it does make it an easier one to enjoy. Younger viewers can follow along without feeling lost, while older audiences don't need to pause every few minutes to remember how some fictional rule works. Sometimes simplicity is a strength rather than a weakness, and I think this movie understands that better than it's often given credit for. The action scenes deserve recognition for another reason. They aren't trying to compete with the massive blockbuster franchises that dominated cinemas around the time. Instead, they build excitement through movement, practical locations, and clear choreography. Watching the film today, I actually found that refreshing, because every chase has a beginning, middle, and end that's easy to follow. The editing never cuts so quickly that you lose track of where everyone is, and that alone makes several sequences more enjoyable than many bigger productions manage. I also found myself appreciating the balance between mystery and entertainment. If the movie had revealed everything too early, the adventure would have lost much of its appeal. If it had withheld every answer until the final act, the middle section could easily have started feeling repetitive. The screenplay finds a comfortable rhythm where each new piece of information pushes the story forward without stalling the momentum. It isn't trying to surprise the audience every 10 minutes. Instead, It keeps building enough curiosity that you want to see where everything leads. One area where the film doesn't always reach its full potential is the dialogue. There are moments where conversations feel a little too direct, almost as if the script wants to make sure every viewer understands exactly what's happening. That's understandable for a family movie, but a bit more subtlety would have helped some emotional scenes land harder. Even so, the performances often smooth over those weaker moments. Dwayne Johnson has a natural way of delivering simple dialogue that sounds more believable than it might read on the page, and that quality helps the movie more than people often realize. The visual effects are another interesting part of the conversation. Watching them today, it's obvious that technology has moved on since 2009, but I don't think that automatically makes the film feel outdated. The effects were designed to support the adventure rather than overwhelm it, and because they're mixed with practical action instead of replacing it outright, many scenes still hold up better than expected. That's something I've come to appreciate more over the years. Movies that rely entirely on digital spectacle tend to age faster than films that know when to combine technology with practical filmmaking. Something else that deserves credit is the decision to keep the runtime relatively tight. A lot of modern adventure movies cross the 2-hour mark because they're busy building enormous fictional worlds, introducing multiple villains, and setting up future sequels. Race to Witch Mountain doesn't fall into that trap. It tells the story it wants to tell and doesn't pad things out with material that doesn't actually improve the experience. I honestly wish more family adventure films followed that example, because not every story gets better simply by getting longer. The response from audiences over the years has also been interesting. While critics were fairly divided when the movie first came out, many viewers who watched it with their families have continued recommending it as an enjoyable weekend film. That gap between critical opinion and audience enjoyment isn't unusual. Critics often judge movies by how much they push a genre forward, while audiences are sometimes just looking for a fun experience that delivers exactly what it promises. In that respect, I think Race to Witch Mountain has built a better long-term reputation than its original reviews suggested it would. After revisiting the film, I came away feeling that its biggest strength isn't any single action scene or effect. It's that the movie understands its own identity from the very beginning. It never pretends to be a groundbreaking science fiction epic, and it never loses itself trying to imitate bigger franchises. Instead, it stays focused on delivering an entertaining family adventure with enough mystery, humor, and action to keep the audience engaged. Sometimes knowing exactly what kind of movie you want to be is just as important as having a huge budget, and I think Race to Witch Mountain is a good example of that. One of the biggest reasons the movie keeps its energy up is that it understands exactly how much information the audience needs at any given moment. Instead of pausing the adventure every few minutes to explain another piece of science fiction mythology, it keeps the focus on the people experiencing those events. That's a smart decision, because the emotional connection always comes before the technical explanation. If viewers care about the characters, they'll naturally stay interested in the mystery surrounding them. Dwayne Johnson continues carrying the film with the same relaxed confidence that's become one of his trademarks. What I liked is that Jack Bruno never feels like someone trying to be the funniest or toughest person in the room. He reacts with common sense, asks the questions most viewers would probably ask themselves, and slowly accepts that the situation is bigger than he first imagined. That gradual shift makes the performance believable, because the audience's perspective changes alongside his instead of being dragged ahead by the screenplay. The supporting cast also deserves more credit than it usually gets. Family adventure movies often struggle because every character starts competing for attention, but here the supporting performances mostly understand their role in the story. They help keep the adventure moving while letting Jack Bruno remain the emotional center of the film. That balance gives the movie a smoother rhythm and keeps it from feeling overcrowded even as several story threads start coming together. Another thing I noticed on this rewatch is how much the movie depends on momentum rather than constant surprises. Some adventure films try to shock the audience every 15 minutes, eventually reaching a point where every new twist feels less exciting than the last. Race to Witch Mountain avoids that trap by keeping its focus on forward movement, as the excitement comes from watching the situation grow more complicated, not from repeatedly trying to fool the audience. I personally prefer that approach because it feels more confident and doesn't lean on artificial suspense. The action sequences benefit from that same philosophy. They're designed to keep the story moving rather than exist purely for spectacle. Whether the film shifts into a chase or a confrontation, those moments usually feel connected to the character's immediate goals rather than showing up just because the movie needs another explosion. That may sound like a small detail, but it makes the pacing feel much more natural. Every action scene has a purpose beyond looking exciting, which helps maintain the flow from beginning to end. Watching the movie today also highlights how much blockbuster filmmaking has changed. In 2009, visual effects were already becoming increasingly sophisticated, but filmmakers still relied heavily on practical locations and physical sets. Race to Witch Mountain sits somewhere between those two eras. It uses digital effects when the story calls for them, yet many scenes still feel grounded because real environments remain central to the experience. I actually enjoyed that balance more than I expected, because it gives the movie a physical quality that some newer productions occasionally lose. The soundtrack quietly contributes to that atmosphere as well. Aaron Zigman's music never tries to overpower the film, and that restraint works in its favor. During the adventure sequences, the score adds enough energy to keep things lively, while quieter moments get a softer musical touch that keeps the focus on the conversations. It's the kind of soundtrack you might not immediately notice while watching, but if it were removed, the film would lose a surprising amount of its personality. It's also worth looking at where this movie fell in Dwayne Johnson's career. He was gradually moving beyond his wrestling fame and proving he could be a dependable leading man for mainstream audiences. Projects like this helped build that reputation, showing he wasn't limited to one type of role. He could headline a family adventure just as comfortably as an action film, and his natural screen presence made that transition feel effortless. Looking back now, it's easier to appreciate how movies like Race to Witch Mountain became stepping stones toward the global career he'd later have. Audience reactions have remained fairly consistent over the years. Most people don't call this one of Disney's greatest films, but they don't dismiss it as forgettable either. Instead, it's earned a reputation as a reliable adventure that's easy to revisit when you want something light, fast-moving, and entertaining. That's actually a respectable achievement, because not every film needs to redefine its genre to be worthwhile. Sometimes delivering exactly the experience people expect is enough, especially when it's done with confidence. The more I think about it, the easier it is to understand why the movie still has its fans. It knows it's making a family-friendly science fiction adventure, and almost every creative decision supports that goal. The performances are approachable, the action stays easy to follow, the mystery remains accessible, and the pacing rarely gives the audience a reason to lose interest. It may not reach the emotional depth or cinematic ambition of the very best science fiction films, but it never promised that kind of experience in the first place. Instead, it focuses on being an enjoyable ride from beginning to end, and I think it succeeds more often than it misses. One thing I enjoyed more on this rewatch was how the movie keeps its sense of adventure alive without constantly trying to become bigger than it needs to be. A lot of modern studio films seem convinced that every new scene has to raise the stakes until the story becomes so large the characters almost disappear. Race to Witch Mountain never completely loses sight of the people at the center of everything, even as the scale of the adventure grows. The film keeps bringing the audience back to Jack Bruno and the choices he has to make. That balance keeps the action feeling connected instead of turning into a collection of random set pieces. Dwayne Johnson's performance benefits from that approach too, because he spends more time reacting than showing off, something I don't think gets mentioned often enough. Many action stars are most comfortable playing unstoppable heroes, but Jack Bruno isn't built that way. He has confidence, but also doubts. He makes quick decisions, yet still feels like an ordinary person who's unexpectedly found himself in an extraordinary situation. That combination gives the character a relatability that fits this movie far better than a larger-than-life action hero would have. Watching the film now, it's interesting to compare it with the family adventures Disney was releasing around the same period. Several leaned heavily toward fantasy, while others focused almost entirely on comedy. Race to Witch Mountain sits somewhere in the middle, mixing science fiction, action, mystery, and light humor without letting any single element take over completely. That mix won't satisfy viewers looking for hard science fiction, but I don't think that was ever the goal, and the movie is much more interested in staying accessible than in building a complicated fictional universe. I also appreciated how the film avoids becoming visually exhausting. Today's blockbusters sometimes fill nearly every frame with digital effects, making it hard for individual moments to stand out. Here, the filmmakers seem more selective, as the bigger visual effects arrive when the story genuinely calls for them, which gives those scenes more impact because the audience hasn't been watching non-stop spectacle since the opening minute. That rhythm makes the adventure feel more balanced and helps the effects blend more naturally with the practical locations. The editing deserves credit too. Good editing often goes unnoticed because its job is to make everything feel effortless, and that's exactly what happens here. Scenes flow into one another smoothly, conversations rarely overstay their welcome, and the action maintains enough clarity that viewers can easily follow what's happening. There are films with far bigger budgets that still struggle with those basics, so it's worth recognizing when a movie quietly gets them right. Another detail that stood out to me was the film's willingness to keep its tone optimistic. That's becoming less common in adventure movies, since many studios now equate darker storytelling with greater maturity. Race to Witch Mountain takes a different path that treats danger seriously when necessary, but it never loses the sense that this is supposed to be an exciting adventure rather than a bleak survival story. I actually think that optimism gives the movie its own identity. It won't appeal to everyone, but it perfectly matches the audience Disney was trying to reach. Something else that deserves recognition is the production design. Without drawing too much attention to itself, it creates an interesting contrast between ordinary, everyday locations and advanced technology. That contrast reinforces the central idea that extraordinary things can suddenly appear in completely familiar places, a classic science fiction concept, but one the movie presents in a straightforward way that never feels unnecessarily complicated. Instead of building enormous futuristic cities or elaborate fictional worlds, it lets the mystery exist within recognizable surroundings, which makes the adventure feel surprisingly grounded despite its science fiction premise. The response from audiences over the years also says a lot about the movie's strengths. It may never have reached the level of Disney's biggest live-action hits, but it's quietly developed a loyal following among viewers who enjoy uncomplicated family adventures. Reading recent comments and discussions, many people mention that the film is simply fun to revisit. They aren't necessarily calling it a masterpiece, but they appreciate that it knows exactly what it wants to be and doesn't spend its runtime trying to imitate larger franchises. In many ways, that's become one of its biggest advantages, because it gives the movie a personality of its own. Looking back at the project from today's perspective, it's also easy to see how it fits into Dwayne Johnson's career. Before becoming one of the biggest box office stars in the world, he spent several years experimenting with different kinds of leading roles. Family adventures like this one broadened his image, showing audiences he could carry a movie through charm and humor just as effectively as through action. That versatility eventually became one of the defining qualities of his career, and Race to Witch Mountain represents an important stage in that journey. After spending more time with the film, I came away appreciating its honesty more than anything else. It never pretends to be a revolutionary science fiction movie, and it never tries to convince the audience it's more complex than it really is. Instead, it delivers exactly what it promises: a fast-moving family adventure with a likable lead, an engaging mystery, solid action, and enough heart to make the experience enjoyable from beginning to end. Sometimes that kind of straightforward filmmaking is exactly what an audience is looking for. And I think that's why this movie keeps finding new viewers years after its original release. Something I appreciated even more on this viewing was how confident the movie feels about keeping the adventure moving without constantly trying to prove how important it is. A lot of family films eventually start adding unnecessary emotional speeches because they want every big moment to feel unforgettable. Race to Witch Mountain doesn't fall into the habit very often. It understands that excitement comes from momentum, and once the audience is invested in the characters, the story doesn't need to keep stopping to explain why the mission matters. That confidence gives the entire movie a smoother rhythm than I remembered. Jack Bruno also becomes a stronger lead because the script never forgets where he came from. Even after everything around him grows increasingly unusual, he still reacts like someone whose life was completely normal not long ago. That keeps the movie grounded. If the main character had accepted every strange event without hesitation, the audience probably would have done the opposite. Instead, Jack slowly adapts to what's happening around him, and Dwayne Johnson sells that progression with a performance that feels relaxed rather than exaggerated. He doesn't overplay confusion or fear, and he doesn't suddenly transform into an unstoppable hero either. The character stays believable because his personality remains consistent from beginning to end. One area where the movie deserves more praise is its ability to entertain without becoming exhausting. Some action adventures seem convinced that louder automatically means better, so every sequence has to top the one before it. After a while, those films start feeling repetitive because the audience gets used to constant spectacle. Race to Witch Mountain spaces its action much more carefully, and the quieter scenes let viewers catch their breath before the pace picks back up, and I think that balance makes the exciting moments land better. The film isn't asking the audience to sit through non-stop chaos, it's inviting them on an adventure that naturally rises and falls instead of staying at the same intensity for 90 minutes. The chemistry between the main cast also helps keep everything enjoyable. A science fiction story like this depends on the audience believing these characters would actually stick together when things get dangerous, and thankfully the performances make that easy. Conversations rarely feel forced, and even the lighter moments fit comfortably within the adventure instead of interrupting it. That's another reason the movie remains easy to watch years later. It never feels like the actors are performing in completely different movies. Everyone understands the tone the filmmakers are aiming for, which keeps the experience surprisingly consistent. The visual side of the movie is also more practical than many people remember. Watching it today, it's clear the filmmakers wanted the action to feel physical whenever possible. Real locations give the story a sense of scale that digital environments sometimes struggle to achieve, and because those locations are recognizable, the science fiction elements stand out even more. Rather than creating an entirely fictional world, the movie places extraordinary events inside ordinary surroundings, a classic Disney adventure formula, but one that still works because it lets the audience imagine these events happening somewhere familiar. I also found myself paying more attention to the camera work this time. It's not trying to show off with complicated movements or rapid editing. Instead, it follows the action in a way that's easy to understand, which sounds simple but has become surprisingly uncommon. There are plenty of modern blockbusters where impressive visual effects are hard to appreciate because the editing moves too fast. Here, the audience is usually given enough time to understand what's happening before the movie moves on, and that clarity makes the action much more satisfying because you're watching the sequence unfold instead of trying to catch up with it. Aaron Zigmund's score continues doing exactly what the film needs. It creates a sense of adventure without becoming so dominant that it overshadows the dialogue or performances. One of the soundtrack's biggest strengths, in my opinion. It supports the mood instead of demanding attention. When the pace picks up, the music naturally follows. When the film slows down, the score quietly steps back and lets the characters carry the scene. That kind of balance often goes unnoticed, but it's an important reason the movie maintains such an easy rhythm from start to finish. It's also worth remembering the period this film was released in, around 2009. Studios were investing heavily in fantasy and science fiction adventures, and audiences had no shortage of big-budget choices. Competing in that environment wasn't easy, especially for a movie aimed at families rather than teenagers or adults. Even so, Race to Witch Mountain managed to find its audience because it offered something slightly different. Instead of chasing darker trends, it stayed committed to being an accessible adventure that parents and younger viewers could enjoy together. Looking back now, that decision probably helped the film age better than if it had simply copied whatever style was popular at the time. Reading audience comments years later, one opinion comes up again and again. People describe this as the kind of movie they can put on during a weekend without worrying about a complicated storyline or an overly long runtime. I actually think that's a compliment. Not every film needs to become an awards contender or redefine its genre. Sometimes its biggest achievement is delivering exactly the experience viewers expected when they pressed play. Race to Witch Mountain understands that responsibility surprisingly well, and even though it has a few weaknesses, it rarely stops being entertaining. In the end, that's probably the biggest reason the movie has continued finding new fans long after its original release. One thing that became more obvious after revisiting Race to Witch Mountain is that it doesn't waste energy trying to convince the audience that every character has a complicated backstory. Instead, it introduces people quickly, gives them a clear purpose, and lets the adventure do the rest. That might sound like a weakness if you're expecting a slow character drama, but for a family science fiction adventure, I think it actually works in the film's favor. The story always knows where its attention belongs, so it rarely gets distracted by ideas that don't move the experience forward. Dwayne Johnson continues being the biggest reason the movie remains enjoyable. His performance isn't built around dramatic acting moments or emotional monologues. It's built around consistency. From the beginning, Jack Bruno feels like someone practical, calm under pressure, and willing to help even when he has no idea what he's getting into. That personality never suddenly shifts halfway through just because the stakes rise. Keeping the character grounded makes everything around him feel a little more believable, which matters in a movie where so many unbelievable things are happening. I also think the movie deserves credit for understanding that mystery only works when the audience is given enough information to stay curious without becoming confused. Some science fiction films become so obsessed with explaining every detail that they accidentally slow themselves down. Others withhold everything for too long and expect viewers to stay interested with almost no answers. Race to Witch Mountain stays somewhere in the middle. Every new reveal feels like another step forward instead of another puzzle designed only to delay the story. That balance keeps the pacing surprisingly smooth, especially for younger viewers who simply want the adventure to keep moving. Watching the film today, I noticed how often it chooses practical solutions instead of relying entirely on spectacle. There are exciting moments throughout, but the filmmakers don't seem interested in making every sequence louder than the last one. They let the tension rise naturally, which means the bigger moments have more impact when they finally arrive. I actually missed that approach, because many modern adventure films seem afraid to slow down for even a minute. Here, quieter scenes are treated as part of the entertainment instead of interruptions between action scenes. The visual effects are another area where expectations matter. Anyone comparing them to today's biggest blockbuster productions will obviously notice the difference, since filmmaking technology has changed a lot since 2009. At the same time, I don't think the movie depends on visual effects alone. They support the adventure rather than carry it completely, which is probably why several scenes still work better than expected. The effects are there to help tell the story, not replace it, and I generally prefer that philosophy over movies that try to solve every problem with CGI. Something else I appreciated was the movie's sense of direction. Even during its busiest moments, it never feels like it's wandering without purpose. Every major sequence pushes the adventure toward the next stage, which keeps the runtime feeling shorter than it actually is. There's very little repetition, And the film doesn't waste time revisiting information the audience already understands. That might sound like a small achievement, but maintaining momentum for an entire family adventure is much harder than it looks. The sound design quietly plays an important role as well. Adventure films often rely on sound just as much as visuals to create excitement, and Race to Witch Mountain handles that balance well. Vehicle chases carry enough impact without becoming overwhelming. The science fiction elements have their own distinct identity, and the quieter scenes aren't buried under constant background noise. Combined with Aaron Zigman's score, the audio helps create a world that feels lively without becoming exhausting. One production detail I found interesting while reading about the film is that Disney wanted this project to introduce the classic Witch Mountain concept to a completely new generation instead of leaning only on nostalgia. That explains why the movie feels modern in its pacing while still keeping the core concept relatively simple. It wasn't made only for people who remembered the earlier films, but also for younger audiences who'd never heard of the franchise before. I think that decision shaped almost every creative choice the filmmakers made. Audience reactions have also become a little kinder over time, which happens with more movies than people realize. Initial reviews often focus on what a film isn't, while later viewers judge it more by what it actually tries to accomplish. In this case, many people revisiting Race to Witch Mountain describe it as an entertaining family adventure that's easy to recommend because it never becomes overly complicated or unnecessarily dark. I understand that point of view, as the movie knows exactly who it's made for, and instead of chasing trends that were popular in 2009, it stays committed to delivering a straightforward adventure that still feels enjoyable years later. After spending more time with it, I don't think the movie's biggest strength is any single action sequence or visual effect. It's the confidence to stay simple when so many other films were trying to become bigger, louder, and more complicated. That simplicity won't impress everyone, but it gives Race to Witch Mountain an easygoing charm that's difficult to fake. Sometimes that's all a family adventure really needs: characters you enjoy watching, enough mystery to keep you interested, and a pace that never lets the experience become boring. On those terms, I think the film does a solid job and continues to be an enjoyable watch. After sitting with the movie for a while, I started appreciating something that isn't immediately obvious on a first viewing. The film doesn't spend its time trying to convince you it's smarter than every other science fiction adventure. It stays focused on telling a clean, easy-to-follow story and lets the entertainment come from the journey instead of constantly trying to surprise the audience. That choice won't satisfy people looking for a complicated mystery with endless plot twists, but I honestly think it fits this movie much better. The simplicity keeps the pace moving and makes the film easy to revisit, because you're never overwhelmed by unnecessary details. Dwayne Johnson deserves another mention, because this role arrived before he became the global box office name he is today. Looking back now, it's interesting to see many of the qualities that later made him one of Hollywood's most dependable stars already present here. He has a natural ability to make even unrealistic situations feel believable because he never overreacts. Jack Bruno isn't constantly trying to be funny, yet the lighter moments still work because Johnson delivers them naturally. He isn't trying to impress the audience every time he's on screen. Instead, he lets the character feel like an ordinary person who happens to be caught in an extraordinary situation, and that approach gives the film a lot of its charm. One area where the movie quietly succeeds is its balance between mystery and action. Many adventure films eventually reach a point where the mystery disappears and everything becomes one long action sequence. Here, the curiosity surrounding the larger story keeps giving the audience a reason to stay invested even when the pace slows down. That balance keeps the experience from becoming repetitive, because every action scene is supported by the feeling that there's still something left to discover. The screenplay isn't perfect, though. There are moments where certain conversations feel a little too straightforward, almost as if the writers wanted to make absolutely sure younger viewers wouldn't miss important information. Personally, I don't think that ruins the experience. but there are a few scenes where slightly more natural dialogue could have added extra depth to the characters. Fortunately, the cast handles those moments well enough that they rarely become distracting. Another thing I enjoyed was how the movie avoids making every supporting character larger than life. In many blockbuster adventures, side characters exist only to deliver jokes or explain the plot. Race to Witch Mountain keeps things much simpler. Everyone has a clear role within the story, and because the film doesn't spend unnecessary time giving every character a huge personal arc, the main adventure never loses momentum. That might sound like a small writing decision, but it helps the movie stay focused from beginning to end. The visual style also deserves a bit more attention. The camera doesn't rely on constant dramatic movements or flashy tricks to make scenes exciting. Instead, it stays close enough to the characters that the audience always understands what's happening. That matters especially during the larger action sequences, because confusion can quickly kill the excitement. Here, the geography of most scenes remains clear, making the adventure feel smooth instead of chaotic. Watching the film today also reminds you how much Hollywood has changed over the last decade. If Disney were making this movie now, it would probably be much longer, packed with more visual effects, and likely designed to launch a larger franchise. Back in 2009, there was still room for standalone family adventures that simply wanted to entertain for around 90 minutes without setting up 5 future sequels. I actually miss that style of filmmaking, because not every enjoyable movie needs to become the beginning of a cinematic universe. The soundtrack continues supporting that old-school adventure feeling. Aaron Zigman's score knows exactly when to add excitement and when to quietly step into the background. It never feels like the music is trying to tell the audience how they should feel. Instead, it follows the rhythm of the story, letting emotional scenes and action scenes breathe on their own. That restraint gives the movie a pleasant rhythm that's easy to appreciate on repeat viewings. One behind-the-scenes detail worth mentioning is that Disney deliberately marketed the film around Dwayne Johnson's growing popularity while also introducing the classic studio property to a younger generation. It was a smart business decision that gave longtime Disney fans something familiar while giving newer audiences a modern action-adventure led by an actor whose popularity was growing every year. Even though the film didn't become one of Disney's biggest financial successes, it performed well enough to remain a recognizable title in Johnson's early filmography. Reading audience comments today, one opinion comes up again and again. A lot of viewers say they first watched Race to Witch Mountain as kids and enjoyed it even more revisiting it years later. I can understand why the movie isn't trying to overwhelm you with complicated storytelling. It simply wants to deliver an entertaining adventure with likable characters, solid pacing, and enough mystery to keep things interesting until the end. Sometimes that's exactly what makes a movie easy to return to. It may never appear on lists of the greatest science fiction films ever made, but it continues doing what it originally set out to do, providing an enjoyable family adventure that still holds up surprisingly well. Something I kept thinking about while watching the movie is how much it benefits from knowing exactly when to move on. Plenty of adventure films stretch scenes longer than necessary, trying to squeeze every possible joke or emotional moment out of them. Race to Witch Mountain rarely does that. Once a scene has delivered what it needs to, the movie keeps moving. That constant forward momentum gives the entire experience a sense of energy that never really disappears. And for a family adventure, I think that's one of its strongest qualities. Dwayne Johnson continues proving why he became such a dependable leading man in the years that followed. What's interesting is that this performance doesn't lean on the larger-than-life personality people now associate with him. Jack Bruno feels much more restrained, confident without being arrogant, capable without becoming unrealistic, and protective without trying to dominate every conversation. Looking back now, it almost feels like a transition period in Johnson's career, where he was beginning to find the style that would later make him one of Hollywood's biggest stars. I also liked that the movie doesn't constantly interrupt itself with comedy. There are funny moments scattered throughout, but they're usually rooted in the situation or the characters rather than random jokes disconnected from what's happening. That approach helps the humor age better because it feels natural rather than forced. Family movies often struggle with this balance, especially when trying to entertain viewers of different ages, but Race to Witch Mountain usually finds a comfortable middle ground. The action deserves another mention because it understands something many modern blockbusters forget: bigger isn't always better. Several sequences generate excitement through timing, movement, and clear objectives instead of endless destruction. As a viewer, it's much easier to stay invested when you always understand why the characters are doing something and what they're trying to achieve. The movie keeps those goals simple, and I think that's exactly why the action remains enjoyable instead of confusing. Watching the film again also made me appreciate how much confidence the directors had in practical locations. Las Vegas isn't just a backdrop for a few establishing shots. The city becomes part of the movie's identity, giving the adventure a recognizable setting that separates it from many science fiction stories set in completely fictional worlds. That choice helps ground the film, because no matter how unusual the events become, they're happening in places that feel familiar. Andy Fickman's direction also deserves credit for keeping the tone consistent. The film never suddenly turns into a dark thriller, but it also doesn't become non-stop comedy. Staying in that middle ground is harder than it sounds, because family adventures often drift too far toward one extreme. Here, the balance stays steady almost the entire time. Younger audiences can enjoy the excitement while older viewers still get enough mystery and action to stay interested. Another thing I noticed is how the movie avoids making technology the main attraction. The science fiction elements are obviously important, but they never replace the characters. Everything futuristic exists to support the adventure rather than become the entire point of the film. I actually prefer that approach, because once visual effects become more important than the people using them, it's much harder to stay emotionally invested. Race to Witch Mountain keeps the focus where it belongs, and that decision makes the adventure feel more personal than it otherwise might have. Aaron Zigman's score quietly continues doing excellent work in the background. It's one of those soundtracks that blends into the movie so naturally you almost stop noticing it while watching. But imagine removing the music entirely, and you immediately realize how much atmosphere it creates. The adventurous tone, the mystery, and even the quieter moments all benefit from a score that understands when to step forward and when to remain almost invisible. One production detail that often gets overlooked is how much pressure came with updating a Disney title that already had a loyal fan base. Revisiting a well-known property is never easy, because longtime fans expect respect for the original while newer audiences expect something that feels modern. Instead of making a scene-for-scene remake, the filmmakers treated this version as a fresh interpretation. That decision naturally divided opinions, but it also let the movie establish its own identity instead of living entirely in the shadow of the earlier films. Looking at audience reactions today, it's clear the movie has settled into a comfortable place. It isn't usually described as an underrated masterpiece, but it's far from forgotten either. Most people remember it as an entertaining adventure with a likable lead, good pacing, and enough science fiction ideas to stay interesting without becoming overly complicated. I think that's a fair assessment. Not every film needs to redefine its genre to be worth watching. Sometimes delivering a fun, well-paced experience is enough, and Race to Witch Mountain succeeds because it understands that from the very beginning. That's probably why it's still an easy recommendation for anyone looking for a light science fiction adventure the whole family can enjoy together. One thing that impressed me after revisiting the film is how comfortable it is with being a standalone adventure. These days it's common for studios to drop obvious hints about future sequels or build an entire cinematic universe before the first story has even finished. Race to Witch Mountain doesn't really have that problem. It stays focused on giving the audience one complete adventure instead of constantly looking ahead. I actually think that helps the movie, because every creative decision feels like it's serving the story happening right now instead of advertising another film that may or may not exist. The more I watched Dwayne Johnson's performance, the more I understood why Disney trusted him with projects aimed at a wide audience. He has an easygoing screen presence that makes people feel comfortable almost immediately. Some actors naturally create distance between themselves and the audience because they always appear larger than life. Johnson does the opposite here. Even when Jack Bruno is surrounded by situations that make absolutely no sense, he reacts with enough honesty that viewers never lose that connection. It isn't his most demanding performance, but it's one of those roles where charisma quietly carries a huge part of the movie. Something else that deserves recognition is the film's confidence in keeping the story accessible. Science fiction has a habit of becoming more complicated than necessary, especially once writers start introducing endless rules about technology, secret organizations, or fictional worlds. This movie avoids that trap by keeping the central ideas easy to follow. Some people might see that as a limitation, but I honestly think it matches the audience Disney had in mind. Families shouldn't have to pause the movie just to understand what's happening, and the adventure works because everyone can stay engaged without feeling lost. The action continues following that same philosophy. Rather than overwhelming the audience with constant destruction, the movie keeps every sequence connected to the characters' immediate goals, which gives the excitement a sense of purpose. When the pace increases, it feels like a natural continuation of the story instead of a random excuse for another explosion or chase. I found that surprisingly refreshing, because many action films confuse noise with excitement. A Race to Witch Mountain usually remembers that the audience needs a reason to care before the action can have any real impact. One area where the film quietly succeeds is its use of locations. Even though the story deals with extraordinary ideas, it spends most of its time in places that feel familiar. That contrast makes the science fiction elements stand out even more, because they're entering a world the audience already recognizes. Instead of building a completely fictional setting, the movie lets everyday locations become part of the mystery, which I think gives the adventure a little more personality than it would have had otherwise. I also appreciated how the film avoids becoming visually cluttered. Modern blockbusters often fill every frame with effects, vehicles, and background activity until it's hard to know where to look. Here, the camera usually guides your attention toward what matters, and that clarity makes the experience much more relaxing because you're never fighting the editing just to understand a sequence. Good visual storytelling often looks simple, and this movie quietly benefits from that approach. Aaron Zigman's music continues fitting the tone perfectly. It never feels oversized or overly dramatic, which is exactly what the story needs. The score adds energy when the adventure speeds up and quietly supports emotional moments without forcing a reaction from the audience. It's one of those soundtracks that becomes part of the movie's identity because it always knows when to lead and when to step back. Behind the scenes, Disney was clearly trying to modernize a classic property without losing the family-friendly spirit that made the original concept popular. That's a difficult balance, because longtime fans usually expect familiar ideas while new viewers expect something contemporary. The finished movie doesn't copy the earlier version scene for scene, and I think that was the right decision. Whether someone prefers the original or the newer interpretation mostly comes down to personal taste, but this version at least has enough confidence to stand on its own instead of constantly reminding viewers of what came before. The response from audiences over time also says something interesting. When people recommend Race to Witch Mountain today, they usually aren't talking about groundbreaking visual effects or an unforgettable plot twist. They're recommending it because it's an easy film to sit down and enjoy with family. That's actually a harder achievement than it sounds. Plenty of movies attract attention during their theatrical release and are rarely mentioned again. This one has continued finding viewers because it delivers exactly the kind of experience people expect from light science fiction adventure without overcomplicating the formula. After spending this much time with the film, I think its greatest strength is consistency. It knows its audience, understands its tone, and never tries to become a completely different movie halfway through. The performances remain likable, the pacing stays quick, the mystery keeps moving, And the action never loses sight of the characters. It isn't attempting to redefine science fiction or compete with the biggest blockbusters of its era. Instead, it focuses on telling one entertaining adventure as well as it can. And that confidence is probably the biggest reason the movie still holds up as an enjoyable family watch years later. By the time the credits were getting close, I realized the movie had quietly done something a lot of modern family adventures struggle with. That never forgot that the audience was following people first and science fiction second. The mysterious technology, the chase sequences, and the larger conflict all helped move the story forward. But none of those elements would have been nearly as entertaining if the characters themselves weren't enjoyable to spend time with. That's probably why the movie still feels surprisingly watchable today, even after the visual effects started showing their age. The personalities at the center of the story continue doing most of the heavy lifting. Dwayne Johnson deserves a lot of credit for that. This role arrived before audiences fully associated him with massive blockbuster franchises. And watching it now almost feels like seeing the foundation of the screen persona he later perfected. What impressed me wasn't the action itself, but how relaxed he keeps the performance. Jack Bruno rarely looks like someone trying to prove he's the toughest person in the room. Instead, he listens, reacts, and adapts to situations that grow stranger by the minute. That makes him much easier to connect with, because he behaves like a regular person instead of an invincible movie hero. The movie also benefits from not stretching its ideas further than necessary. Some adventure films introduce one mystery after another until the story becomes unnecessarily complicated. Here, the writers seem aware that the audience doesn't need constant surprises to stay interested. Once the central mystery is established, the film simply keeps building on it instead of replacing it every 20 minutes with something completely different. I appreciated that restraint, because it gives the adventure a much smoother flow. You never get the sense that the screenplay is desperately trying to hold your attention with random twists. Another detail I noticed this time was how consistently the tone is maintained. Some films begin as family adventures and suddenly turn much darker during the final act, almost as if they forget who they were made for. Race to Witch Mountain avoids that problem. It keeps the excitement, humor, and science fiction elements working together without letting one completely overpower the others. That consistency might not sound especially exciting on paper, but it's one of the reasons the movie feels comfortable to watch from beginning to end. The action continues following the same philosophy. Instead of relying on endless explosions, the movie focuses on movement and urgency. Every chase has a purpose, every confrontation pushes the story forward, and the audience is rarely left wondering why a particular sequence exists. That's something I always appreciate, because action becomes much more satisfying when it's connected to the story rather than interrupting it. The filmmakers clearly understood that spectacle means very little if viewers don't care about the people involved. The technical side of the film quietly supports that approach as well. The editing keeps the pace lively without becoming frantic, and the camera always seems interested in showing the audience what matters instead of constantly trying to impress with complicated movements. There were several moments where I caught myself thinking how refreshing it was to actually understand every action sequence without the movie cutting away every second. That clarity might seem like a basic filmmaking skill, but plenty of much larger productions still struggle with it. One thing I also found interesting is how the movie represents a very specific period in Disney's live-action strategy. Around that time, the studio was experimenting with modern versions of older properties while also trying to attract younger audiences with no connection to the originals. Some of those projects became massive hits, while others found smaller but loyal fan bases over time. Race to Witch Mountain clearly belongs to the second group. It didn't dominate the box office, but it managed to build a reputation as an entertaining adventure that's easy to revisit. The soundtrack continues helping that experience more than people often realize. Aaron Zigman's music never feels like it's trying to steal attention from the action or the performances. Instead, it quietly strengthens the atmosphere in the background. Adventure scenes gain extra energy, quieter moments become more reflective, and the overall rhythm of the movie feels more complete because the score understands exactly what kind of film it's supporting. That's often the sign of a well-composed soundtrack, and you might not leave the movie humming every theme, but you'd definitely notice something missing if the music weren't there. Audience opinions have also aged quite well. Reading more recent reactions, it's clear that many viewers judge the movie very differently now than critics did back in 2009. Instead of comparing it to every other science fiction blockbuster released that year, people tend to judge it on its own terms, and once you do that, many of its strengths become easier to appreciate. It's fast, approachable, family-friendly, and never asks the audience to treat it like a grand cinematic event. It simply wants to entertain for a little over 90 minutes, and for the most part, it succeeds. After revisiting the movie from start to finish, I honestly think that's the best way to describe it. Race to Witch Mountain isn't trying to become the most ambitious science fiction adventure ever made. It's trying to give viewers an enjoyable ride with a likable lead, steady pacing, memorable action, and just enough mystery to keep everything moving. Sometimes movies become more enjoyable once you stop expecting them to be something they were never trying to be. Judged as a family adventure, this film delivers a fun experience that's still easy to recommend, especially if you're looking for something light, entertaining, and easy to revisit. One thing that really stood out to me after finishing the movie was how comfortable it is with being a simple adventure. That might not sound like a compliment at first, but I honestly mean it as one. Plenty of movies become so obsessed with looking bigger than everything around them that they forget why people started watching in the first place. Say they keep adding new twists, bigger villains, louder action, and longer runtimes until the original charm disappears. Race to Witch Mountain never falls into that trap. It sticks to its own identity from beginning to end, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons it's still enjoyable years later. Dwayne Johnson's performance also feels more important now than it probably did back in 2009. At that point, he was still proving he could lead different kinds of movies instead of being limited to one image. Looking back with today's perspective, it's easy to see why studios kept giving him larger projects. He has a natural ability to make the audience feel comfortable almost immediately, even when the story asks viewers to accept some unusual science fiction ideas. Jack Bruno remains believable because Johnson never plays him like a superhero. He reacts, questions, worries, and adapts in ways that feel surprisingly grounded. And that grounded approach gives the entire movie a stronger foundation. Something else I appreciated was how the film never becomes overloaded with unnecessary characters. Big adventure movies often introduce so many people that half of them barely have anything meaningful to do. Here, the story stays focused on the relationships that actually matter, which keeps the pacing under control because the audience isn't constantly switching between different storylines. Every important scene feels connected to the main adventure instead of serving as a distraction from it, and I think that decision helped the movie age better than some of its bigger budget competitors. The screenplay also deserves more credit than it usually gets. It isn't trying to impress viewers with complicated dialogue or endless exposition. Instead, it keeps conversations clear and direct, so the momentum never disappears. There are definitely moments where the writing could have been a little sharper, especially during some emotional exchanges, but the overall rhythm stays consistent. I never felt like the movie was stopping just to explain itself. It always seemed more interested in moving forward, and for this kind of family adventure, that was probably the right choice. Another area where the film quietly succeeds is its sense of scale. Even though the story deals with ideas much larger than everyday life, the movie never loses the feeling that everything is happening in a recognizable world. Familiar roads, buildings, and city locations help keep the adventure grounded, making the science fiction elements stand out even more. I actually prefer that approach over movies that spend all their time inside completely fictional environments, because it becomes much easier to imagine the adventure happening somewhere real. The action continues benefiting from clear direction. One of the easiest ways to lose an audience during an action scene is by making everything so chaotic that nobody understands what's happening, but fortunately that rarely becomes a problem here. The camera gives each sequence enough room to breathe, the editing keeps everything easy to follow, and the pace stays energetic without becoming exhausting. It's a reminder that excitement doesn't always come from making scenes louder, sometimes it comes from making them easier to enjoy. The visual effects naturally show that the movie belongs to the late 2000s, but I don't think they hurt the experience as much as some people suggest. Technology has improved enormously since then, so comparisons with today's biggest blockbusters aren't entirely fair. More importantly, the effects aren't carrying the entire movie by themselves, they support the adventure while the performances, pacing, and direction do the rest. That's one reason several sequences still hold up better than expected. They're built around storytelling first and visual effects second. Aaron Zigman's music also continues fitting the film perfectly, rather than trying to become the center of attention. The score quietly supports whatever mood the story needs at that moment. Adventure scenes gain a little extra excitement, quieter conversations feel warmer, and the mystery always has just enough atmosphere without becoming overly dramatic. It's the kind of soundtrack that blends into the movie so naturally you almost forget it's there until you stop and think about how different the experience would feel without it. Looking at the movie's reputation today, I think time has actually been kind to it. When it first came out, many reviews compared it to larger science fiction releases and expected it to compete on the same level. Watching it now, that comparison doesn't really feel necessary. The film works much better when judged for what it actually wants to be instead of what other people expected it to become. It's a family adventure built around mystery, action, and entertainment, and on those terms, it succeeds far more often than it fails. The biggest compliment I can give Race to Witch Mountain is that it never feels like it's chasing trends. It has its own pace, its own personality, and a clear understanding of its audience. Not every scene is perfect, not every line of dialogue lands exactly as intended, and there are moments where the movie could have pushed certain ideas a little further. Even so, it remains fun, approachable, and surprisingly easy to revisit. That's probably why people keep recommending it after all these years, not because it changed the science fiction genre forever, but because it delivered an enjoyable adventure with confidence. And sometimes that's exactly what audiences are looking for. After spending this much time with the film, I started paying less attention to the individual action scenes and more attention to how everything fits together. That's where I think Race to Witch Mountain earns more credit than it usually gets. Nothing in the movie feels like it exists just for the trailer. Every chase, every mystery, and every emotional beat is there to keep the adventure moving instead of stopping it. That may sound like a basic filmmaking goal, but plenty of much bigger productions lose that balance because they're too busy trying to create one unforgettable moment after another. One reason the movie still works is that it doesn't overload the audience with unnecessary emotional drama. Modern adventure films sometimes pause every 20 minutes for a speech about friendship, sacrifice, or believing in yourself. Here, those ideas are present, but they're mostly communicated through the characters' decisions instead of long conversations. I actually prefer that approach, because it lets the audience understand the message naturally without feeling like the movie is constantly trying to teach a lesson. Looking at Dwayne Johnson's performance again, it's interesting to compare it with the roles he plays today. His screen presence has always been one of his biggest strengths, but this film shows a version of him that's a little more restrained. He's still confident, but the character spends much more time reacting than taking control of every situation. That makes Jack Bruno feel approachable, and I think it's one of the reasons younger audiences connected with him. He isn't written as someone perfect, just someone trying to do the right thing once he realizes how serious the situation has become. The supporting cast quietly helps maintain that feeling. Nobody seems interested in stealing scenes or turning every conversation into a comedy routine. Each performance supports the overall tone, and that consistency makes a bigger difference than people sometimes realize. Family adventures often become uneven because different actors seem to be making completely different movies, but that never really happens here. Everyone understands the style the film is aiming for, which helps the story maintain the same energy from beginning to end. I also appreciated how the film handles suspense. It doesn't rely on shocking twists every few minutes, because it knows constant surprises eventually stop being surprising. Instead, the tension grows from the feeling that the characters are always moving towards something bigger. That approach keeps the audience interested without forcing the screenplay to invent unnecessary complications. It's a quieter way of building excitement, but I think it suits the movie much better than non-stop plot twists would have. The technical side of the production also deserves another mention. The editing keeps everything moving without becoming difficult to follow, and the camera rarely gets in the way of the action. There are plenty of recent blockbusters where impressive effects are hidden behind rapid cuts and shaky camera work, but Race to Witch Mountain takes a cleaner approach. It lets the audience actually see what's happening, which makes the action feel much more satisfying because every sequence has a clear beginning, middle, and end. One thing I found interesting while reading about the production is that Disney wanted the movie to appeal to families who had never even heard of the original Witch Mountain films. That explains why the story doesn't depend on viewers already knowing the franchise. It works as its own adventure first, while the connection to the older movies becomes more of a bonus for longtime Disney fans. From a studio perspective, that was probably the smartest way to introduce the concept to a new generation. The soundtrack continues doing exactly what it needs to do. Aaron Zigman's music doesn't compete with the performances or the action. It quietly supports both. During faster scenes it adds energy without becoming overwhelming, and during calmer moments it creates just enough atmosphere to keep the adventure feeling alive. It's not the kind of score people usually discuss when talking about great film music, but it fits this movie so naturally that it's hard to imagine the same experience without it. Audience opinions also make more sense after revisiting the film. Many people describe it as the sort of movie they can easily watch again after several years, because it doesn't ask for a huge emotional investment or require viewers to remember dozens of complicated plot details. Sometimes that's exactly what makes a film enjoyable. You can sit down, relax, and let the adventure unfold without feeling like you're preparing for a 3-hour epic. That simplicity has become one of the movie's biggest strengths as time has passed. If I had to point out one weakness, I'd probably say the film occasionally plays things a little too safely. There are moments where it could have taken bigger creative risks or explored some of its science fiction ideas in greater depth. At the same time, I understand why the filmmakers chose this direction, as their priority was making an adventure that families of different ages could enjoy together, and in that respect, the movie stays remarkably consistent. It knows exactly what experience it wants to deliver, sticks to that plan, and finishes without losing sight of the audience it was made for. That's a quality that deserves more appreciation than it often receives. After finishing the movie, I kept thinking about how different it feels from the kind of family blockbusters that usually come out today. Most modern studio adventures are designed to become the beginning of a franchise, so they spend a surprising amount of time introducing future storylines instead of making the current one as satisfying as possible. Race to Witch Mountain doesn't carry that burden. It tells one adventure, gives it a proper beginning and ending, and never feels distracted by the idea of setting up something bigger. I honestly miss that style of filmmaking, because it lets the audience enjoy the movie for what it is instead of constantly waiting for the next chapter. The biggest reason the film stays enjoyable is still Dwayne Johnson. This isn't the version of him audiences now associate with giant action franchises where he's expected to dominate every scene. Here, he's much more relaxed. The character succeeds because of his personality as much as his physical presence. Jack Bruno comes across as someone dependable without trying to impress everyone around him, and that makes the performance feel genuine. Watching it today, it's easy to see why directors kept trusting Johnson with leading roles. Even when the script isn't doing anything extraordinary, he has a way of keeping scenes engaging simply through his screen presence. Something else that deserves recognition is the film's confidence in keeping the story accessible. There are science fiction movies that almost seem proud of confusing the audience, but this one never falls into that trap. The ideas are easy to understand, The objectives remain clear, and every major sequence pushes the adventure forward without unnecessary detours. That doesn't mean the screenplay is flawless. Say there are a few moments where the dialogue could have been sharper, but I never reached a point where the movie felt lost inside its own mythology. It always remembers that entertainment comes before complexity. The action also continues reflecting that philosophy. Every chase and confrontation feels connected to the story instead of existing purely for spectacle, which is one of the reasons the pacing remains so consistent. The movie isn't stopping every few minutes to show off expensive visual effects. Instead, it lets those moments appear naturally whenever the story needs them. Looking back, I actually think that restraint helps the film age better than some larger productions from the same period. Once visual effects become the only attraction, they usually start looking outdated much faster. Here, they're supporting the adventure rather than replacing it. I also appreciated how the filmmakers made good use of real locations. Even with all the science fiction elements, the movie rarely loses the feeling that these events are happening in a world people recognize. That contrast gives the adventure a stronger sense of realism, because extraordinary situations are unfolding inside ordinary environments. It's a simple creative decision, but it makes the mystery feel more believable than if everything had taken place inside a completely fictional setting. Another strength is the editing. Adventure movies live or die based on rhythm, and this film almost always keeps that rhythm under control. Scenes don't linger long after making their point, and the transitions between quieter moments and larger action sequences feel smooth. I never had the feeling the movie was wasting time just to pad its runtime. It knows when to slow down, when to speed up, and when to move on, which is exactly what a 90-minute family adventure should be doing. Aaron Zigmund's score deserves one final mention because it quietly holds the emotional tone together from beginning to end. The music isn't trying to become the star of the film. Instead, it supports the mystery, the excitement, and the lighter moments without pulling attention away from the characters. That's probably why the soundtrack fits the movie so naturally. It understands the adventure rather than trying to overpower it. It's also interesting to look at the movie through today's perspective. Since its release, audiences have seen countless science fiction adventures with much larger budgets and more advanced visual effects. Even after all those years, Race to Witch Mountain still manages to remain entertaining because it was never relying only on technology. The likable cast, the straightforward storytelling, and the fast pace continue doing most of the work. Those qualities don't become outdated nearly as quickly as computer graphics do, and that's one reason the film continues finding new viewers. Reading recent audience reactions, one comment appears surprisingly often. People say it's the kind of movie they can watch with the whole family without worrying that it will become too dark, too complicated, or unnecessarily long. I think that's one of the best compliments a film like this can receive. It knows exactly who it's made for and never loses confidence in that identity. Not every adventure needs to reinvent the genre. Sometimes delivering a fun, well-paced experience is more than enough. When I look at the movie as a whole, I don't see a forgotten blockbuster that deserved to become a massive franchise, and I also don't see a disappointing remake that failed to justify its existence. I see a family adventure that understood its audience, stayed focused on its strengths, and delivered an entertaining experience without pretending to be something it wasn't. That's probably why it's remained easy to recommend after all these years. It may not rank among Disney's biggest live-action classics, but it succeeds at the job it set out to do, and there's real value in that kind of honest filmmaking. After spending enough time with Race to Witch Mountain, I think the easiest mistake someone can make is judging it as if it were trying to compete with the biggest science fiction blockbusters of its time. I don't believe that was ever the intention. Disney wasn't chasing the scale of the biggest franchises in cinemas. The studio was making a fast-moving family adventure that mixed mystery, action, and science fiction into something viewers of different ages could enjoy together. Once I looked at the film from that perspective, a lot of its creative decisions started making much more sense. Dwayne Johnson remains the biggest reason the movie works as well as it does. His performance isn't built around dramatic speeches or emotionally heavy scenes. Instead, he gives the audience someone they can comfortably follow from beginning to end. There's a calm confidence in the way he plays Jack Bruno that makes even the most unusual situations feel believable. It's also interesting to compare this role with the movies he'd make later. Today, audiences immediately recognize him as one of Hollywood's biggest action stars, but this film captures a stage where he was still expanding his range and proving he could lead projects aimed at the whole family just as naturally as straightforward action films. Another reason the movie continues to hold up is that it never becomes overcomplicated. That's something I appreciated more during this rewatch than I did years ago. Modern adventure films often introduce so many plot threads that they forget to make the central story satisfying. Race to Witch Mountain keeps its attention on one clear adventure and lets everything else support that goal. The result is a film that feels focused instead of overcrowded. Even if some viewers wish the science fiction ideas had been explored in greater depth, the straightforward approach also makes the movie much easier to revisit, because you can simply enjoy the ride without trying to remember dozens of complicated details. The technical work deserves recognition as well. The cinematography stays clear throughout, giving the audience a solid view of every important moment instead of hiding the action behind overly aggressive editing. The production design also helps create an interesting contrast between familiar locations and extraordinary events. Rather than building a completely artificial world, the filmmakers let the mystery unfold inside places that already feel recognizable, which adds a little extra charm to the experience. Aaron Zigman's score quietly ties everything together from beginning to end. It's never trying to overpower the movie or tell the audience exactly how to feel. Instead, it adds just enough excitement during the larger moments while letting quieter scenes breathe on their own. That kind of restraint often goes unnoticed because it isn't trying to grab attention, but it's one of the reasons the movie maintains such an easy rhythm. Looking back at the film's release, it arrived during a period when studios were investing heavily in fantasy and science fiction entertainment. Competition was strong, and many movies were trying to become the next major franchise. Race to Witch Mountain found a different path by keeping its ambitions realistic. With a production budget reported at around $65 million, it earned more than $100 million worldwide. Those numbers weren't record-breaking, but they showed there was still an audience for family adventures focused on fun instead of overwhelming spectacle. Audience reactions over the years have probably become the movie's biggest advantage. While critical opinions were mixed at release, many viewers have continued recommending it as an entertaining choice for families and younger science fiction fans. Something I noticed while reading more recent discussions